The cold air brought silence to the forest. With the retreat of the star behind the ridgeline, the atmosphere in this high altitude quickly cooled. A quick tap against the wristcom showed 8.8 Celsius and falling. Soon the moisture in the air would condense on every surface, creating a layer of frost that would only grow as time passed. Jamie Sayer took a deep breath and exhaled into her light rebreather. Waiting, while on the edge, was rough. She tried to relax, but her muscles wanted to be tense, ready to send her into the fight. Until that fight arrived, Jamie was stuck in this dugout overlooking the mountain road. There was no chatter on the comms. Her unit knew better than to create any sort of signal that might give away their position. Plenty of zealous revolutionaries had met their end in the early days by doing that. Those days were long over. The foolish and overeager were culled with explosions, laser beams, and the occasional evaporation from a particle projection cannon. All that were left were those fighters who were just smart enough to live through one more day. Jamie wasn't old enough to fight in those early days, but she was smart enough to learn from those who did. Of all the skills she had picked up over the last 6 months, that was the most useful. A glow of light in the distance brought Jamie back to focus. Their position was around a rock outcrop on a heavily forested pass through the mountains between two large urban areas. In more peaceful times, it was a rarely used road that saw more vacationers and fishermen than anything else. The revolution had changed that. Flights of goods and personnel across the mountains became very dangerous. The large supply of anti-aircraft missiles stored on the planet in various depots provided the revolutionaries with plenty of ammunition. After a few dozen flights were struck with missiles, that left only orbital flights and land-based convoys. One of those convoys started to creep around the outcrop of rock in the distance. Jamie adjusted, gripped her weapon, and took several long, slow breaths to try and calm herself. The first few vehicles were military. Even in the darkness, their garish, bright green and gray camo stood out. Jamie sighed at the arrogance on display. The next vehicles to turn the corner were supply trucks that still had the symbols of the planet's defense force on them, but were clearly being repurposed to ship supplies. As the last vehicle, an armored personnel carrier, turned the corner, Jamie took one last breath, lifted her weapon, and the next second was one that she and her partner Titus had practiced. And at nearly the same moment, she fired her rocket into the lead vehicle while he fired his into the trailing armored car. Instead of an explosion, the rocket burst several feet from the target, and it sprayed each vehicle with a thick, gelled substance that ignited a half-second later. The instant conflagration was so bright that Jamie had to turn away from it. Ducking back into her dugout, she grabbed a second rocket and slid it carefully into the launcher. Back up into the fray, the light from the fires completely changed the surrounding forest. Shadows danced everywhere in the chaos of gunfire. Jamie lined up her next shot and pulled the trigger. The rocket streaked across the ridge and shattered into 1,000 small metallic fragments. Many of them peppered the second truck in the convoy, rendering the engine block and cabin a ruined heap of scrap metal. A piece of shrapnel sliced through something flammable inside, because an explosion ripped the truck apart a second later, sending a half-dozen soldiers nearby sprawling to the ground. The truck itself was launched several feet into the air and twisted in a manner that it sent it tumbling down the side of the mountain on the far side of the road. Jamie had mere moments to appreciate the impact of her work as the call went out on the comms to advance towards the column. Her comrades who were dug in along the ridge overlooking the road were up out of their foxholes and making their way down, rifles firing as they advanced. Jamie left the RPG tube and grabbed her rifle before hopping out of the hole. The saplings scattered between the taller pine trees made the journey a little easier, but the steepness of the hillside made the trek a dangerous one. Firing every few seconds, Jamie eventually reached the culvert next to the road. The next several seconds were a blur as it seemed like the whole world blew apart. Several jets streaked over her head, following the path of the road. She was forced to drop her rifle and cover her ears, even with the ear protection on, as the ridgeline behind her was bathed in flame. Jamie looked at the road and saw a perfect shadow as the forest behind her became a firestorm. A second explosion farther down the culvert created a wall of dirt and fire that tossed rebels, vehicles, and soldiers as if they were weightless. Jamie felt the air being pulled out of her lungs before being thrown into the air. The light from the fires was all she could see before the world went dark. Waking to the sounds of birds, Jamie squinted in the bright morning light. The star was rising, bathing everything in its slightly orange light. Able to focus more, Jamie could see trees, broken and burnt remnants of trees, and the occasional chunk of what used to be part of the convoy. Lifting her head, Jamie felt an intense ache that ran up and down her body, and that's when she realized she wasn't lying flat. Letting her head hang, she was actually lying on the side of the mountain, head down, wedged between a tree stump and a chunk of still warm truck door. With the shove, she was able to push the door off and pull herself into a sitting position against the trunk. Her rifle was nowhere to be seen, and Jamie's helmet was missing along with the comm gear attached to it. Besides some achy muscles, scrapes, and a fat lip, Jamie seemed to be unscathed. After looking up the mountain, the road seemed very far away, and it was astonishing to her that she was alive at all. Jamie looked down at herself and saw that her scrappy mountain gear was still good, though she decided to take it easy getting up. The last thing she wanted to do was misjudge her strength or injuries and tumble the rest of the way down the mountain. Sitting there, listening to the world around her, Jamie could pick out the gentle crackle of fires in the distance, the birds of course, and nothing else. This could be a good thing if the attack had completely failed, and there were soldiers around. It could also be very bad if her team had thought her dead and moved on, abandoning her in the wilderness. Finally climbing up to face the side of the ridge, Jamie began the long journey of climbing up to the road. Though she couldn't see it, it had to be there somewhere, since that's where most of the lingering smoke was rising. The transition from forest to charred rock and burnt wood was a tough one, and many of the handholds were unreliable or still smoldering. Jamie was trying to focus on the task at hand, but couldn't help but try and piece together what happened to the plan. Those jets that flew over must have bombed the hillside and the culvert. If they were there, they must have expected the attack. If she made it out of this, there'd be a lot of questions to answer. When she reached the broken blacktop of the roadway, Jamie stumbled to a sitting position against the guardrail. When she caught her breath, she surveyed what was left of the convoy and the ridge above. Almost everything was charred black, burning, or smoldering. Jamie could make out the bodies of soldiers mixed with those of her former comrades, none of which were moving. The realization that she had likely lost everyone in her unit hit Jamie hard, and it was a struggle to get herself moving again. It would have been far easier to just lay there and wait for the next Falcon patrol to come by and execute her. As it turned out, that was a likely outcome, since as soon as Jamie was up on her feet again, a Falconer soldier stumbled from behind one of the destroyed APCs. He had a pistol in one hand, while the other arm hung limp at his side. Both of them were startled by the other, and as Jamie fell back trying to scramble over the guardrail, the soldier called out, "Wait! I will not shoot! Please!" His words were dripping with fear, and in that moment Jamie could sympathize. It looked like he was alone and abandoned as she was. She stopped midway over the guardrail, and when she was reasonably sure he wasn't going to lift his pistol to shoot her, she crawled back. "You're supposed to shoot me on sight," Jamie said, with hesitation. I just want to go home," the soldier replied, which further suggested to Jamie that he was way out of his depth in this situation. "Are you hurt?" Jamie asked, while stepping closer. She wasn't sure if she was closing in to help or to snatch that pistol away. That decision might have to be made in the moment. After a couple of steps, the young soldier lifted the pistol, and that stopped Jamie's advance. With a quivering grip, the soldier pointed it at her and asked, You're one of them, aren't you? A terrorist?" "I just want to go home, same as you," Jamie responded in a way that would hopefully diffuse some of the tension. The soldier lowered his gun a little, but not enough to give Jamie an opening to continue moving forward. He glanced around as if to emphasize his point when he said, "You did this. You killed everybody." Jamie bristled and then responded, "Some of those jets that bombed the roadway seemed to do most of the damage. I'd be willing to bet good cash that they were flying from a Falconer base." The soldier seemed to be doing the mental math in his head for a few moments before stumbling and falling back against the wrecked APC. He slid down the side to a sitting position, the gun still pointed in Jamie's general direction. Jamie turned, grabbed a helmet off of the ground, and sat on it. She decided that for now her best option might be to talk her way out of this. If a Falconer unit came by, perhaps she could convince the soldier to let her sneak off. It seemed more plausible than being able to run away now and avoid his fire. "You haven't served long. You look younger than me," Jamie said, sizing up the wounded soldier. "I've been on planet for 2 weeks. Long enough," the soldier retorted. "Were you born from a can?" Jamie asks in a snarky manner. The soldier bristled and then responded, "I am not a true-born warrior. I was born in the inner sphere. My parents are in a laborer caste." "Well, I suppose you have that going for you. I find the other types so insufferable. They think they're perfect, and it just plays off as arrogant," Jamie said, while casually picking up a spent shell casing to hold in her hand. She then asks, "Do you even know why you're here?" "I'm here because I volunteered to serve the Jade Falcons. I'm here because I believe in the stability and prosperity the clan brings to planets they conquer," the soldier replied as if it was memorized from a textbook. Jamie sighed. "That sure sounds like something they would teach you. What if I told you there was stability and prosperity on Tippin 5 before you Falcons showed up and broke everything?" It was this young soldier's turn to shake his head, and after a rough, wet cough that suggested there was something damaged inside of him, he retorted, "I've read the history of this planet. You were ruled over by a duke who murdered his way into power. There might have been stability and prosperity, but not for most of the people." "Well, at least there weren't prison camps and the Falconer's unique brand of totalitarianism," Jamie added, annoyed with his off-worlder's input on the previous administration. "Ah yes, because the Duke was so loved that any opposition to him just magically disappeared. Where do you think it went?" the soldier asked, twisting the rhetorical knife. "That doesn't justify what the Falcons did," Jamie muttered. "It's just not as clear-cut as you like to believe. I may be new here, but I'm smart enough to know that there are rarely any clean-cut fights between good and evil," the soldier said, and Jamie seethed, feeling like she was just chastised for a childlike view of the galaxy. After a long few seconds, Jamie said, "We won't give up fighting." "I know," the soldier responded, and then he added, "That is the nature of these things. You fight for your oligarch, or whoever replaces him or her." Nearly 2 minutes passed before anyone said anything again. Eventually, Jamie asks, "Are you going to turn me over to them?" "I should. Look what you did to my unit," the soldier says. "What's your name?" Jamie asks, after not getting a definitive response to the first question. "It's Mal. That's short for Malthus," Mal said with a sigh that was interrupted by more hard coughing. Jamie sighed at the stereotypical name, but responded, "I'm Jamie." She watched him cough again, this time with even more wet guttural sounds. "I think you're really hurt. More than just your arm," she added. "Yes, I fear I may need..." Mal paused for several seconds to build up strength to finish his next sentence. "Some significant medical attention." The barrel of the pistol was now resting on the ground as the Falcon soldier started to fade. Jamie's attention was called to the left, up the pockmarked road. "Hang in there. I think I hear something," she said, getting up and trying to get a view past the wreckage to the bend around the rock. This time, instead of the rumbling of internal combustion engines, Jamie heard the heavy thud of gigantic steps. This could mean only one thing. She walked up to Mal and took his pistol from his now limp hand. She looked down at him, and he lifted his head to look up at her. At that moment, he looked even younger. His eyes swelled with fear as he coughed up crimson. Jamie felt sorry for him, and it surprised her. She felt nothing but anger and hatred for the Falcons for years, but here is one, and he just looked like a scared little kid. She looked at the pistol in her hand, and as the thumping steps approached, she turned away and started to run and leapt over the guardrail, sliding down the side of the mountain as quickly as she could. When the battle mech turned the corner, it quickly scanned the wreckage of the convoy, picking out heat signatures. Jamie's was not on the screen. The Black Lantern twisted its torso, surveying the damage, and started to pick its way down the roadway. When it approached the front, the faint heat signature of Mal showed up on the screen. As Jamie made her way down the mountain, trying to put as much distance between her and the mech as possible, she could hear the sound of helicopters in the distance. She wondered if they would be there in time to save Mal. Then she felt conflicted by that desire that he survive. This is the end of part 1. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the first part of the story. If you wish to support it in the creation of more content like this, I would appreciate your subscription. I promise to work hard to keep earning it. Thank you, and see you next time.